He lived in a house that was not a home, a place where the air always seemed to carry the faint scent of old soup and disinfectant. It was a building of long, echoing hallways and doors that were never truly closed, a place filled with the constant low hum of other people's lives. For the boy who lived there, life was a practice in being invisible. He was good at it. At 12 years old, he had already learned the art of melting into the background, of becoming part of the furniture so that the loud noises and the sharp tempers of the world would pass him by. He was just one of many, a face in a crowd of other kids who, like him, were just passing through, waiting for a place to land. His world was small, contained within the peeling walls of the group home. The other boys had their groups, their games of basketball in the cracked courtyard, their loud conversations about girls and video games he never joined. They were not mean to him, not really, but they treated him like a piece of fragile glass. They saw his hands first and everything else second. His hands, which the doctors had given a long, complicated name for, were simply a part of him he had always known. The fingers were twisted and pulled inward, the knuckles swollen, the palms often clenched into tight, stubborn fists that he couldn't always uncurl on his own. They were hands that could not grip a ball or tie a shoelace or write a legible sentence. They were hands that marked him as different, and so he kept them tucked into the sleeves of his worn-out sweatshirts, hiding them away like a shameful secret, because his hands could not do the things other hands could do. He had learned to do other things with his mind and his eyes. He became a watcher. He watched the way the afternoon light hit the dust motes dancing in the air. He watched the tired lines around the house mother's eyes as she poured cereal into bowls. He watched the sparrows outside the window, fighting over crumbs. His world was one of observation, a silent movie playing out just for him, and he rarely felt the need to add his own voice to the soundtrack. He was a quiet boy in a loud world. He had mostly made his peace with that. But there was one place where his silence was not empty. In the common room, tucked between a broken vending machine and a bookshelf filled with paperbacks missing their covers, sat an old, upright piano. It was a forgotten thing, its dark wood finish scarred and sticky in places, a fine layer of gray dust blanketing its lid like a shroud. It was mostly used as a shelf for stray backpacks and jackets that missed the coat rack. To the other boys, it was just another piece of old furniture, as silent and useless as the rest of the room's forgotten junk. But to the boy, it was a mountain of possibility. At first, he just stood near it, drawn by the mystery of it. He imagined the songs it must have played in a different life, in a warm living room filled with laughter and the smell of baking. One afternoon when the house was empty and the only sound was the buzz of a fly against the window pane, he dared to touch it. He ran the side of his clenched fist along the dusty lid, clearing a small path. He felt the cool wood beneath his skin. He had never had a lesson, did not know how to read a single note of music, but the piano did not seem to care about that. It did not ask for his background or his story. It just sat there waiting. He lifted the heavy lid, propping it up with the thin stick that was nestled inside. The yellowed ivory keys stared back at him, a perfect, orderly row of possibilities. He hesitated, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. His hands were useless for so many things. What could they possibly do here? He reached out, not with his fingers, which would not obey, but with the heel of his right hand, pressing it down firmly onto a group of keys in the middle of the keyboard. A sound loud and jarring and alive exploded into the quiet room. It was not a pretty sound, but it was his sound. The vibration of the string traveled up his arm and into his chest, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something that was not observation, but creation. That spark became a fire. The dusty piano became his church, his confessional, his stage. It became the one place he did not have to be invisible. Every afternoon he would find a sliver of time when no one was around and would sit on the worn bench. He discovered he could not press the keys one by one, but he could press many at once. He learned to use his palms like drumsticks, striking the keys to create rich, full chords. He found that by striking with the side of his hand, he could create a brighter, more percussive tone. His forearms, strong from years of using them to help him move, could sweep across the keys, creating cascades of sound that were chaotic but beautiful. It was a strange, athletic, and deeply personal form of playing. It was not the graceful dance of fingers over keys that he had seen in movies. It was a full-body experience. He would lean into the piano, his whole body swaying with the effort, his face a mask of concentration. He was not playing Beethoven or Mozart. He was playing himself. The crashing, angry chords were the sound of his frustration with his body, his loneliness in a crowded house. The soft, gentle melodies he coaxed from the higher keys were the sound of his longing, his secret hopes for a family, for a place where he belonged. The music was the only language he had to say all the things his mouth could not form. The piano, the forgotten old thing, was his voice, and he sang his soul's song through its dusty strings. He lost track of the days and weeks, living for the hour or two he could spend at the keys. His arms would ache, his palms would be sore, but his spirit would soar. The music he made filled the empty rooms of the house, and for a little while made them feel less empty. He was no longer just a watcher. He was a participant. He was a creator. He was a musician, even if no one but the dusty old piano knew it. One Tuesday, a new piece of paper appeared on the community bulletin board, tacked up over a notice about lost laundry. It was brightly colored, with fancy lettering that screamed importance. The boy, curious, wandered closer. It was an advertisement for an audition. The city's most famous music school, a place he had only ever heard of in whispers, was looking for new students. The name on the flyer was associated with prestige, with polished performances, with a world so far from his own that it might as well have been on another planet. It was a place for prodigies, for kids who had been taking lessons since they could walk. He looked at the flyer, then down at his hands, hidden in his pockets. The idea was so ridiculous, so impossible, it was almost funny. They would laugh him out of the building. They would look at his twisted fingers and see him not as a musician, but as a joke. He turned away, a bitter taste in his mouth, but the flyer stayed with him. The image of the bold letters was burned into the back of his mind. That night, lying in his bunk, listening to the snores of the other boys, he couldn't sleep. He thought of the music he made, the feelings he poured into that old piano. Was it any less real because his hands were different? Was the passion he felt any less valid? The world had always told him he couldn't do things because of his hands. But at the piano, he could. He could create something powerful and true. The flyer wasn't really about a school, he realized. It was a chance. A chance to be heard. A chance to show the world what was trapped inside him, waiting for a voice. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But a new feeling was growing beside it, a tiny, flickering flame of defiance. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, he went back to the bulletin board. He carefully peeled the flyer from the wall, folded it into a small, neat square, and put it in his pocket. He did not know if he was good enough. He did not know if he was brave enough. But he knew he had to try. The day of the audition arrived under a sky the color of dull steel. The boy woke up long before the sun, his stomach churning with a mixture of dread and a strange electric excitement. He had practiced for weeks, pushing his body and the old piano to their limits. His hands and arms were a constant map of aches and bruises, but his mind was sharp, filled with the music he had chosen. He picked out his best clothes, which weren't very good at all. A pair of gray pants that were a little too short and a stiff button-up shirt that had belonged to someone else before him. The collar felt tight against his neck, like a warning. He carefully folded the flyer and put it in his pocket. Next to a crumpled $5 bill the house mother had pressed into his hand with a quiet, "Good luck." It was the most money he had ever carried. The bus ride to the other side of the city was a journey into a different world. As the buildings grew taller and the streets cleaner, the boy felt more and more like an imposter. He pressed his face against the cool glass, watching his own world of brick and concrete give way to a land of polished granite and perfect trees. People waiting at the bus stops wore coats that looked new and straight. Their faces were relaxed, unburdened. He pulled his sleeves down, making sure his hands were completely hidden. He felt like a smudge on a pristine painting. When he finally got off at the stop indicated on the flyer, The conservatory building stood before him like a grand old temple, its stone steps flanked by tall, imposing columns. It was the most intimidating and beautiful place he had ever seen. For a moment, he just stood on the sidewalk, a small, insignificant figure in front of a giant. Feeling the powerful urge to turn around and get back on the bus, he forced his feet to move, one after the other, carrying him up the wide steps. The heavy glass doors swooshed open, revealing a world that was even more overwhelming than the outside. The air inside was different, cool and still, and it smelled of old wood, floor wax, and a faint sweet scent he couldn't place, maybe from the flowers in a large vase on a marble table. The floor was so shiny he could see his own warped reflection looking back up at him. The sound in the lobby was a soft murmur, a hush that felt respectful, like being in a library or a church. The boy's sneakers, which had never seemed loud before, squeaked with every step he took, announcing his arrival to the hushed room. He felt 100 pairs of eyes turn toward him, a brief, curious flicker before looking away. He found the registration desk, a long expanse of dark wood, and a woman with a severe haircut and a polite but distant smile looked down at him. He had to speak twice. His voice was so quiet. She checked a list, gave him a numbered tag to pin to his shirt, and pointed him toward a large set of doors down the hall. The audition hall. Please wait until your number is called. The hall was even more breathtaking. It was a huge, cavernous space with a vaulted ceiling and velvet curtains, the color of deep red wine. Rows of plush red chairs were filled with people, a sea of adults and children who all seemed to belong to this elegant world. The boy felt utterly alone. He found an empty chair in the very last row, tucked into a corner where he hoped he wouldn't be noticed. He looked around at the other kids waiting for their turn. They were all so perfect. A girl in a velvet dress sat perfectly still, her posture so straight she looked like a doll, her delicate violin case resting beside her like a pet. A boy in a crisp suit was having his tie adjusted by his father, who was whispering instructions in a serious tone. Another group of teenagers huddled together, their expensive French horns gleaming under the lights, talking confidently about difficult passages and composers he had only read about. They were all musicians. They had the right instruments, the right clothes, the right families. He had his worn-out shirt and a body that couldn't even hold a pencil properly. He felt the familiar sting of shame and pulled his hands into his sleeves. Making himself as small as possible, he wasn't just invisible. He was an anomaly. He could feel the whispers without hearing them. People's eyes would pass over him, then do a double-take, lingering on the boy who didn't fit. They weren't being cruel, not out loud. It was a quiet, subtle exclusion, a sense of a club to which he would never be a member. A mother sitting a few seats away from him saw him looking at her daughter's flute and gave him a tight, pitying smile before turning away. He saw the look and felt it like a physical blow. He was not a potential peer. He was an object of pity, a sad story. He watched as one kid after the next was called to the stage. They would walk confidently up the 3 steps, bow to the panel of judges, and then play. The music that filled the hall was beautiful, but it all sounded the same to him. It was technically perfect, every note in its place, every rhythm precise, but it felt empty. It was like looking at a beautifully painted photograph of a person instead of the person themselves. It was missing the mess, the struggle, the heart. But the judges, seated at a long table on the stage, seemed to love it. They would nod, make notes on their papers, and thank the performer with cool, professional smiles. At the center of the table was the man everyone seemed to be trying to impress. He was older, with a full head of silver hair combed back from his high forehead, and he wore an impeccably tailored dark suit. He was the director of the conservatory, a famous conductor whose picture was sometimes in the newspapers. From his seat in the back, the boy couldn't see his face clearly, but he could see his posture. The director sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, looking utterly bored. He seemed to be a man who had heard it all, a man who was impossible to impress. He rarely clapped, and when he spoke to the other judges, his lips moved with a quick, sharp motion. He was the king of this world, and he looked like he was tired of his own kingdom. The boy watched him, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. How could he ever hope to move this man? He was going to play his strange, percussive music on his strange, broken body. They would laugh. They would laugh him right off the stage and out of the building. The thought was so vivid and so painful that he had to fight the urge to just get up and leave right then, before they could call his number. He could be on the bus, heading back to the familiar comfort of his dusty, forgotten piano, where his music was safe and his mistakes were his own. He squeezed his eyes shut, picturing the keys, the way the vibration felt in his bones. He thought about the passion that drove him to play, the feelings that no one else could see, but that the piano understood. He was here to share that. It was the only thing he had to give. Finally, a voice over the speaker called his number. The sound of his number in that elegant hall felt like an accusation. He took a deep, shaky breath and stood up. The walk to the stage was the longest walk of his life. Every eye in the hall was on him now. He could feel their curiosity, their pity, their unspoken questions. He walked up the steps, his legs feeling like lead. The stage lights were bright and hot, and he could see the sea of faces looking up at him. He made his way to the grand piano sitting center stage. It was a magnificent beast, sleek and black and gleaming, so much more intimidating than his dusty old friend. He struggled for a moment to get onto the high, smooth bench, his awkward movements drawing a few more whispers. He finally positioned himself, his back ramrod straight, his hands still hidden in his lap. He looked out at the panel of judges. They were all looking at him with a professional calm, except for the director. The director leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light, and his face was no longer bored. It was sharp with something that looked like impatience, or maybe anger. He raised a hand and held it up, a gesture that commanded silence and stopped the boy before he could even begin. The director's hand was not raised to give permission, but to deliver a command. It hung in the air between them, a sharp, arresting gesture that froze the boy in place. The bright stage lights suddenly felt too hot, the silence in the hall too heavy. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating against its cage. He had prepared for nerves, for the possibility of playing poorly, for the simple act of being judged. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for being stopped before he had even begun. From his seat on the bench, the boy could see the director's face clearly now. It was a face that was not old, but aged, lined with authority and a deep-seated impatience. His eyes, a piercing, cold shade of blue, were fixed on the boy with an unnerving intensity. The other two judges on the panel, a woman with kind eyes and a younger man who looked nervous, shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the interruption. But the director held all the power in that room. He knew it. The director leaned into his microphone, the movement deliberate and dismissive. His voice, amplified by the speakers, filled the grand hall. It was not a shout, but it carried the weight of a shout, cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "Young man," he began, and the words were laced with a condescending edge that made the boy shrink. "What is this? What do you think this is?" The director didn't wait for an answer. He gestured vaguely, not just at the boy, but at the entire situation. "This is a house of art, not a circus. We are here to find musicians, not to indulge in pathetic sentimentality." A soft, collective gasp rippled through the audience. A few parents in the front rows exchanged shocked glances. The boy on the stage felt a flush of heat creep up his neck and burn his face. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to melt through the floorboards and escape the weight of all those eyes, the sound of that voice. He had spent his life being quietly overlooked, and now he was being loudly, publicly humiliated. This was 1,000 times worse. The director leaned back in his chair, a cruel, thin smile touching his lips. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power he held to crush a spirit with just a few words. "We have heard in the last hour 12 violinists, 8 pianists, and a very promising young cellist. They have dedicated their lives to this craft. They have practiced for thousands of hours. They have bled for their art." He looked directly at the boy's hidden hands. "And you come here. You walk onto my stage with this display. Do you think you deserve to be here? Do you think this is some kind of inspirational movie moment?" The director's voice rose, filling every corner of the vast hall. I have spent my entire life fighting against the dumbing down of great art. I have fought against the idea that passion alone is enough. It is not. Art requires discipline. It requires sacrifice. It requires skill. It requires hands that can do the work. His voice boomed, echoing in the cavernous space. The boy sat frozen, a statue of shame. Every word was a stone, and he was being pelted with them. He could feel the tears welling up behind his eyes, hot and stinging. He fought them back with every ounce of his will. He would not cry. He would not give this man the satisfaction. This is an insult. The director continued, his voice dropping to a lower, more venomous tone. It is an insult to the craft, to music itself, and it is an insult to every single child who has worked and bled to be here today. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The hall was so quiet now that the boy could hear his own ragged breathing. He could hear the faint hum of the lights above him. He could feel the collective judgment of the room pressing down on him. All of it orchestrated by the silver-haired man on the panel. Then the director stood up. The movement was sudden and dramatic. He placed his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked out at the audience, then back at the small, humiliated boy on the stage. He was making a spectacle of him, turning his private pain into a public theater. "I'll make you all a promise," he declared, his voice ringing with terrible certainty. "I'll make a promise to this boy." He took a step away from the table. His eyes locked on the boy's. "I will get down on my knees right here on this stage. In front of everyone," he said, his voice booming. "If that boy can even play a single coherent note on that piano." The words hung in the air like a guillotine. There was a beat of absolute stunned silence. Then a few people in the back of the hall let out nervous titters. The titters grew into chuckles, then into a low, rumbling wave of cruel laughter that swept through the audience. The adults, the same people who had been whispering with pity moments before, were now laughing at his expense. The sound was worse than any insult. It was the sound of his deepest fears being realized, the sound of his hope being torn to shreds and tossed to the wind. He was a joke. He was the fool they all thought he was. The director raised his hands, as if conducting the laughter, a triumphant look on his face. He had made his point. He had proven his power. He had defended the sanctity of his art from the boy who dared to defile it. He looked back at the boy, expecting to see him break, see him run from the stage in tears. But the boy did not run. Something shifted inside him as he sat there. The object of the world's scorn. The shame was still there, a hot, burning fire in his gut. But alongside it, something else was growing. It was small at first, a tiny ember buried deep within the ashes of his humiliation. But then it began to glow, and then to burn. It was the memory of the dusty piano in the common room. It was the memory of the vibration of the strings traveling up his arm. It was the memory of the music he had created, the music that was his and his alone. The director could mock his body. He could mock his appearance. But he could not mock his music because he had not yet heard it. He did not know what it was. The laughter in the hall started to die down, replaced by a confused, expectant silence. The director was still looking at him, his arrogant expression starting to falter just a little, confused by the boy's stillness. The boy slowly lifted his head and met the director's cold blue eyes. For the first time that day, he did not feel like an imposter or a victim. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated defiance. This man wanted a show. This man wanted to be entertained by his failure. He would give him a performance. But it would not be the performance the director was expecting. The boy took a deep, shaky breath, the air filling his lungs and clearing his head. He looked down at his hands, still clenched in his lap. They were not good hands. They were not normal hands. But they were his hands. They were the hands that had found a voice when his mouth had none. The director thought he was a joke. The audience thought he was a fool. He was about to show them all that they were wrong. He was about to show them the storm that lived inside him, trapped behind a wall of flesh and bone. He was about to let it out. The silence that followed the director's cruel challenge was heavy and absolute. It was the silence of an audience holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, for the boy to shatter into a million pieces on the polished stage. The boy could still feel the phantom echoes of their laughter, a vibration of shame that clung to his skin. But beneath that shame, the ember of defiance had finally caught fire, burning away the last of his fear. He was no longer a supplicant begging for a chance. He was a musician, and this was his stage. He did not look at the director again. He did not look at the judges or the sea of faces in the hall. He turned his attention inward to the storm of music that lived inside him. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world of judgment and light. In the darkness behind his eyelids, there was only the black and white of the piano keys and the feelings that needed to be set free. He remembered the flyer, the image of the grand building, and the tiny flickering hope he had dared to nurture. He remembered the lonely hours spent in the common room, his body aching, his soul soaring as he coaxed melody from the dusty old upright. This was for that boy. This was for the music that had saved him. With a resolve that felt as solid as stone, he positioned himself on the bench. He did not try to place his fingers on the keys in the traditional way. He knew that would be impossible. Instead, he did what he had done 1,000 times before. He brought his arms up, his hands still clenched, his posture not that of a classical pianist, but of a boxer ready to fight. He held his forearms parallel to the keys, his muscles tensed. For a moment, he was still. The audience watched, captivated by the strange, unorthodox posture. The director's triumphant smirk had faded, replaced by a look of sharp, annoyed curiosity. Then it began. It was not a single coherent note, as the director had mockingly demanded. It was an explosion. The boy brought his forearms down upon the keys with a force that seemed to come from the very core of his being. The sound that erupted was not delicate or refined. It was thunderous, raw, and violent. A cluster of low, dissonant chords crashed through the hall like a wave, so loud and unexpected that several people in the audience physically jolted in their seats. It was the sound of a door being kicked open, of a dam breaking, of a scream finally given a voice. It was the sound of all the frustration and loneliness and anger he had ever felt, unleashed upon the world in a single brutal chord. The boy did not stop. His arms, which had once been symbols of his limitation, became instruments of creation. He began to play, his body a blur of motion. There was no graceful arch of the wrist, no delicate touch of the fingertip. It was a percussive, athletic, and strangely beautiful dance. He struck the keys with the heels of his palms, creating deep, resonant booms that were the heart of the storm. He used the sides of his hands like hammers, the sound sharp and biting. He swept his forearms across the keys, the motion creating cascading arpeggios that were less like individual notes and more like a torrent of water rushing over rocks. He was playing a piece by a composer the director would have known well, a piece known for its technical difficulty and emotional depth. But the boy was not just playing the notes on the page. He was reinventing the piece for his own body, for his own soul. He was not just playing the piano. He was wrestling with it, fighting it, and in the fight, drawing something out of it that no one had ever heard before. The music was not just loud, it was alive. It was filled with a desperate, soaring passion that felt almost too real, too raw to be contained in the elegant hall. It was the sound of a spirit that had been caged and was now breaking free, clawing its way into the light. The cynical, amused expressions on the faces in the audience began to melt away. The whispers died. The shifting in seats ceased. They were no longer watching a sideshow. They were witnessing something elemental, something profoundly and unexpectedly moving. A woman in the third row, who had been whispering to her husband, now sat with her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The girl with the violin, who had looked so perfect before, now looked small, and her own practiced skill suddenly seemed hollow in the face of such raw power. The two other judges on the panel had leaned forward, their professional masks completely gone, replaced by looks of pure astonishment. They were not just hearing music. They were feeling a story. On the stage, the boy was lost in the storm. His eyes were still closed, his face a mask of intense concentration and deep emotion. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his temples. He was giving everything he had, pouring every ounce of his being into the music. The powerful, crashing chords gave way to a quieter, more desperate section of the piece. Here his technique changed. He used his knuckles to tap out a frantic, insistent rhythm on the higher keys. The sound brittle and sharp, like ice cracking. It was the sound of his longing, his fear, his vulnerability. It was the sound of a heart breaking. The contrast between the thunderous power and the fragile, aching melody was heartbreaking. The entire hall was holding its breath, completely under his spell. And at the center of it all was the director. He stood exactly where he had been, a statue of disbelief. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. The arrogant smirk was long gone. In its place was a look of profound shock. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide as he stared at the boy on the stage. This was not the pathetic spectacle he had anticipated. This was not the sentimental joke he had mocked. This was genius. Not the polished academic genius he valued, but a raw, untamed, ferocious genius that came from a place of deep struggle and transcended the limitations of the body. He saw the boy's body, so different from what was considered normal, and for the first time, he did not see a defect. He saw the source of the music. He saw the fight in every note, the pain in every melody, the triumph in every powerful chord. The boy had taken his cruel public challenge and had answered it not with a single note, but with a symphony of defiance. He was not just playing the piano. He was proving the director's entire worldview wrong. The music began to build again, quiet desperation giving way to a new wave of power, this time not just angry but triumphant. The boy's body swayed with the rhythm, his arms flying across the keys with a newfound grace. It was the sound of a spirit that had been tested by fire and had emerged not just unbroken, stronger, brighter, and more beautiful for having been broken. The climax of the piece was approaching, a tidal wave of sound that was going to wash over everyone in the room. The boy poured everything he had into it, every memory, every feeling, every ounce of strength. He was no longer the quiet, invisible boy from the group home. On that stage, in that moment, he was a giant, and his music was his voice, roaring for the entire world to hear. The final, resounding chords were not an ending, but an arrival. He had finally been heard. The last chord of the piece hung in the air of the grand hall, not as a single sound, but as a vibration that seemed to saturate the very air itself. It was a sound of such power and finality that it echoed in the silence that followed, a phantom presence in the room. The boy's arms were still resting on the keys, his body slumped with exhaustion. His chest heaved with each ragged breath, the air burning in his lungs. He felt utterly spent, as if he had poured every drop of his life force into the music. For a long moment the world seemed to stop. No one in the hall moved. No one spoke. It was a silence so complete, so profound, that it was more deafening than any applause. The audience, the judges. Everyone was held captive by the ghost of the music that had just filled the room. The boy slowly lifted his head, his eyes still wet with tears that he had not been able to hold back. He looked out at the sea of faces, but he couldn't really see them. He was still in the world of the music, his body humming with the aftershocks. He expected something, anything, a polite smattering of pity claps, a few whispers of shock, the sound of people gathering their coats to leave. He braced himself for it. But it didn't come. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, and then, from the very back of the hall, a single sound broke it. It was the sound of one person clapping. It wasn't a fast clap, but a slow, deliberate, and heartfelt sound. It was the sound of someone who had been so deeply moved that they could not contain it any longer. That single clap was like a spark in a dry forest. A person a few rows ahead heard it and joined in, then another and another. The quiet clapping began to build, growing in speed and volume, spreading like a wave through the stunned audience. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted. But this was not the polite, reserved applause that had greeted the earlier performers. This was a thunderous, emotional roar. People were on their feet, their faces alight with awe and wonder. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the foundations of the old building. There were shouts of bravo and bravo, voices raw with emotion. Men in expensive suits and women in silk dresses were wiping tears from their eyes, their composure completely shattered by the raw power of what they had just witnessed. They were not just applauding a performance. They were celebrating a miracle. They were applauding the triumph of the human spirit. The boy sat on the bench, stunned. He watched as the entire audience rose to their feet, a wave of humanity standing in his honor. He had never seen anything like it. He had never felt anything like it. The sound washed over him, no longer a threat, but a wave of acceptance, a validation so complete it was almost overwhelming. A fresh wave of tears streamed down his face, but this time they were not tears of shame or pain. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a joy so pure it was almost painful. He saw the girl with the violin, her own eyes shining with tears as she clapped with a fierce intensity. He saw the other two judges on their feet, applauding with huge smiles on their faces. They were not just acknowledging his skill, they were acknowledging his heart, but the most shocking thing was yet to come. On the stage, still standing in the same spot he had been from the beginning, was the director. The arrogant, silver-haired king of this world had not moved. The roar of the crowd seemed to wash right over him as if he were in a bubble of his own profound shock. His face was a picture of utter disbelief. The coldness in his blue eyes had been replaced by a look of deep, humbling awe. He looked at the boy, not as an anomaly or a joke, but as a force of nature. He had built a career on rules and discipline, on a very specific definition of what art should be. This boy had just taken his entire rule book and burned it to the ground with his music. He had shown the director that true art was not about perfect fingers or polished technique. It was about truth, about the unfiltered, unyielding expression of the soul. He had been humbled, not by a superior skill, but by a superior spirit. Slowly, deliberately, the director began to move. He turned away from his fellow judges and walked down the 3 small steps from the raised platform. His walk was no longer that of a conqueror. It was the walk of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. The hall began to quiet down as people noticed his movement, the applause softening to a murmur of anticipation. He crossed the stage, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, until he was standing right in front of the piano, right in front of the boy. He was so close the boy could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. The director looked not at the boy, but out at the audience, as if he needed to make his next action a public statement. Then he did something that made a collective gasp ripple through the hall once more. He slowly, gracefully, and without a hint of hesitation, lowered himself to his knees on the floor of the stage. He knelt there in his expensive suit in front of the boy and the entire audience, his head bowed for a moment. It was the act of a man making a public penance. He was not just keeping his cruel, sarcastic promise. He was kneeling in worship, not of the boy, but of the music, of the indomitable spirit that had created it. It was the most profound apology ever offered, a silent acknowledgement of his own ignorance and a testament to the power he had just witnessed. The boy looked down at the silver-haired man kneeling at his feet, and his heart felt like it would burst. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel superior. He felt a deep, aching sense of connection. In that moment, the boy and the director were not a judge and a performer, or a bully and his victim. They were just 2 human beings, humbled by the same incredible, transcendent thing. The director rose slowly to his feet, his face no longer arrogant but soft and full of a respect that was almost painful to see. He did not speak to the audience. He leaned in close to the boy, his voice a low, earnest whisper that was just for him. "Forgive me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And welcome to our conservatory." The roar that went up from the crowd was even louder than before. It was a roar of catharsis, of redemption, of pure, unadulterated joy. The boy did not know what would happen next, what his life would look like from this day forward. But as he sat there, the applause washing over him like a warm, cleansing rain, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the invisible boy from the group home. He was a musician, and he had finally, truly been heard. The dusty, forgotten piano had given him a voice, and he had used it to change the world, one thunderous, beautiful note at a time.